I was lying on a cold, sterile operating table, the smell of antiseptic burning my nostrils, while tears streamed down my face and soaked into the thin paper pillow beneath my head. I looked at the man standing beside me, the man who had promised to cherish me, to protect me, to be my partner through everything, and I begged him. I actually begged him. Through choked back sobs, I asked him if we could just go home, if we could just use condoms, if we could just talk about this one more time. He didn't even flinch. He just looked at me with a cold, detached indifference and told me it was for the best. And then the anesthesia took over, and I drifted into a darkness that felt a lot more like a metaphor for my life than I realized at the time. How does a marriage go from a dream life abroad to a nightmare, where you're paying your husband's child support for a kid that isn't yours, all while recovering from a C-section you had 48 hours ago? How do you end up in a situation where you've sacrificed your career, your savings, and your literal body for someone who mocks the house you bought for him? I thought I was building a life. I thought I was being the strong wife that society tells us to be. But sitting here now, looking at the scars on my abdomen, not just from the birth of our child, but from the procedure he forced me into, I realized I wasn't building a life. I was building my own prison, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. And today, I finally decided to stop laying the bricks. But as I sat him down to tell him the truth, I had no idea if I was finally escaping or if I was about to find out that the man I loved never actually existed in the first place. To understand how I got to that operating table, you have to understand where we started. Only a few years ago, our life looked completely different. We were living in the Middle East, and honestly, it was beautiful. I had a career I loved, a solid circle of friends who felt like family, and a sense of independence that I took for granted. I was successful. I was happy. We were a team, or at least that's what I told myself back then. But then, the floor dropped out from under us. My husband lost his job. In that part of the world, when the job goes, the visa often goes with it. The life we had built was suddenly on a timer. I watched the man I loved deflate, and my first instinct, my natural, nurturing instinct, was to catch him. I told him it would be okay. I told him we'd figure it out. When he suggested moving back to the United States to live with his parents until we got back on our feet, I didn't hesitate. I packed up my entire life, said goodbye to the career I had spent a decade building, and left my friends behind. I walked away from everything I knew because I believed in us. But the us I believed in stayed in the Middle East. The person who landed on American soil with me was someone I barely recognized. Suddenly, we were living in his parents' house. If you've ever been a grown adult, successful in your field, and suddenly found yourself sleeping in your in-laws' spare room, you know the blow it deals to your psyche. But I didn't let it stop me. I immediately pivoted. I took on 1099 contract work, remote jobs that allowed me to work from anywhere at any hour. I worked like a woman possessed because I knew we needed a way out. My husband, however, didn't seem to have that same fire. He didn't have a job, but he certainly had expenses. There was the child support for his son from a previous relationship, $1,000 every single month. Then there was the debt. I found out he had racked up $15,000 in credit card debt. $15,000 of where did this go money. Do you know what I did? I paid it. All of it. I sat at my computer for 12, 14 hours a day, my eyes blurring from the screen, so I could send $1,000 a month to his ex-wife and chip away at those credit card balances. I used every cent of my savings, the money I had tucked away back when I had a real career, just to keep our heads above water. He told me he'd pay me back. He promised that once he got a job, he'd replenish the savings for our oldest child, $4,000 that I'd had to dip into just to buy groceries and gas. I believed him because I had to. If I didn't believe him, then I had to admit I was being exploited, and I wasn't ready to face that reality yet. But the red flags weren't just waving, they were screaming. While I was drowning in work, he decided he wanted a truck. Not a sensible used car to get him to interviews. A truck. I told him no. I told him we couldn't afford to be tied up in a multi-year loan when we didn't even have our own place to live. I begged him to wait. But he wanted it. And in our marriage, what he wanted eventually became what we did, just to keep the peace. So, we got the truck. Another monthly payment added to the pile on my desk. I reached a breaking point with the living situation. Living with his parents was suffocating. I needed a home for our family. So, I worked even harder. I took on a second job. I saved every scrap I could. And eventually, I did it. I bought a house. It was a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom house built in 1955. It wasn't a mansion, but it was ours. It was a roof over our heads that I had provided through sheer will and exhaustion. I expected him to be proud. I expected a thank you or a honey, you did it. Instead, he mocked it. He called it old. He said it was too small. He told me he wanted a house with at least 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, with a massive yard. He stood in the kitchen I was paying for and complained about the lack of counter space, while he hadn't contributed a single dime to the down payment or the mortgage. I felt a crack in my heart that day, but I pushed it down. I had to. I was pregnant. That pregnancy should have been a time of joy, but it was one of the most grueling periods of my life. Because I was a 1099 contractor, there was no maternity leave, no paid time off. If I didn't type, we didn't eat. If I didn't attend meetings, the mortgage didn't get paid. I worked right up until the moment I went into labor. It was a C-section, a major abdominal surgery. They literally cut through my muscle and shifted my organs to bring our child into the world. I gave birth on a weekend. By Monday morning, I was back at my desk. Can you picture that? Imagine sitting in a hard office chair, your abdomen stitched together, your body screaming in pain, leaking and exhausted, while you try to sound professional on a Zoom call. I was balancing a newborn and a laptop, my vision swimming from sleep deprivation, while my husband, well, he was just there. He wasn't working. He wasn't looking for work. He was just living in the house I bought, driving the truck I paid for, watching me crumble. But the worst was yet to come. A few weeks after the birth, while I was still healing, he told me he had scheduled a procedure. Not for him, for me. He didn't want any more kids. He didn't want to wear condoms. So his solution was for me to go back under the knife. He scheduled a laparoscopic tubal cauterization for me. I was already so fragile. My body hadn't even recovered from the C-section. I didn't want it. I was terrified of more surgery, more pain, more holes in my body. On the drive to the hospital, I broke down. I was sobbing, shaking, begging him to just be responsible on his end so I didn't have to do this. He just looked at the road and kept driving. He told me he wasn't going to change his mind. And because I was so burnt out, so drained of any self-worth, I walked into that hospital and let them burn my tubes. I woke up with 3 new holes in my body, 1 in my belly button and 2 on my sides. I felt hollow, not just physically, but spiritually. I was working 3 jobs now, morning, afternoon, and evening. In between those shifts, I was cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the kids. I was a ghost in my own home. And then, one night, looking at him sitting on the couch while I scrubbed the pot after a 12-hour workday, something finally snapped. I realized I couldn't do it for one more day. I asked him if we could talk after the kids went to bed. He agreed, looking annoyed that I was interrupting his peace. We sat down, and for the first time in years, I didn't hold back. I let the floodgates open. The house was silent. That heavy, suffocating kind of silence that only exists when 2 people are living in a war zone of their own making. The kids were finally asleep, tucked away in their rooms, blissfully unaware that their mother was currently vibrating with a decade's worth of suppressed rage and heartbreak. I sat across from him in the living room of the house I had bought, the house he called small, the house he called old. And for a moment, I just looked at him. I looked at the man I had moved across the world for, the man I had bankrupted my emotional and financial reserves for, and I felt nothing but a cold, hard clarity. "We need to talk," I said. My voice sounded thin, like parchment paper ready to tear. He looked up from his phone, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He nodded, but he didn't put the phone down immediately. He finished whatever he was scrolling through before finally setting it on the coffee table. "What's up?" he asked, as if I were about to ask him what he wanted for breakfast the next morning. And then I just let go. I didn't plan a speech. I didn't have notes. I just started at the beginning, at the moment the foundation of our life started to crumble. "Do you remember the Middle East?" I asked him. "Do you remember the life we had there? I had a career. I had friends. I had a future that I had built with my own two hands. And when you lost your job, I didn't hesitate. I didn't complain. I packed up my entire existence and moved into your parents' spare bedroom because I loved you. I thought we were a team." He started to say something, but I held up a hand. The floodgates were open now, and there was no stopping it. "I moved here with nothing but my skills and my drive," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "And while you were figuring things out, I was the one who became the breadwinner. Not just for us, but for your past too. I paid your child support. $1,000 every single month for a child that isn't mine, while you sat on the couch. I paid off $15,000 of your credit card debt. Money I didn't spend. Debt I didn't spend. Debt I hadn't even known existed until it was staring me in the face. I used every cent of my savings, the money I had worked so hard for back when I actually had a life, just to buy us groceries, just to keep the lights on. And you promised me you'd pay it back. You promised me we'd replenish the savings for our oldest child. But $4,000 is a lot of money when you're the only one working, and that money is long gone, isn't it?" I paused, waiting for him to defend himself, to offer some kind of excuse. But he just sat there, his face blank, staring at a spot on the wall behind me. His silence was like a physical weight in the room. "And then there was the truck," I said, my voice cracking. "I told you we couldn't afford it. I told you I didn't want us tied to a loan for years. But you didn't care. You wanted it, so I made it happen. I took on more hours. I slept less. I did everything I could to make sure you had what you wanted while I was literally falling apart. And when I finally managed to buy us this house, a house I am proud of, even if it was built in 1955, you laughed at it. You made fun of it. You told me it was too small, too old, that you wanted something bigger, something better. Do you have any idea what that felt like? To hand you a home and have you spit on it because it wasn't a mansion?" I could feel the heat rising in my chest, that familiar burn of resentment that had been simmering for years. I was shaking now, my hands clenched into fists in my lap. "But the worst part," I whispered, the tears finally starting to fall. "The absolute worst part was when I gave birth. I had a C-section. They cut me open. I was in so much pain I could barely walk to the bathroom. And because I'm a 1099 contractor, because I have no one to fall back on, because you won't get a job, I was back at my desk on Monday morning. 2 days. I had 2 days to recover from major surgery before I had to start earning money for this family again. I sat in that chair, bleeding and hurting, while you watched me. You watched me do it, and you didn't even offer to help." I took a shaky breath, trying to steady my voice. "And then, just weeks later, you made me get that procedure. I begged you. I cried the whole way to the hospital. I told you I didn't want it. I told you we could use condoms, that there were other ways. But you didn't want to hear it. You didn't want to be responsible, so you forced me to go through another surgery. I woke up with holes in my body, feeling like a shell of a person. And I did it all because I thought that's what a good wife does. I thought if I just gave enough, eventually you'd start giving back. I was struggling to catch my breath now, the weight of everything I'd been carrying finally crushing me. I told him I loved him, that I'd tried so hard to stay true to our vows, but that he was making it impossible. I told him I was burnt out, that I was exhausted, and that I couldn't keep doing this alone. I waited for him to say something. I waited for him to apologize, to cry, to tell me he'd change. But he didn't cry. He didn't even look particularly upset. He was quiet for a long time, the only sound in the room the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, he spoke. "I'll try to be better," he said, his voice flat. "I'll look for a job." That was it. That was the extent of his response to years of my sacrifice and pain. "I'll try." I didn't even have the energy to argue. I just stood up, grabbed a blanket from the closet, and went to the living room. I spent the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd let my life get to this point. He slept in the bedroom, in the bed I paid for, in the house I bought. I told myself I'd give him a week. 1 week to show me he was actually going to make a change. 1 week to see if there was anything left of the man I'd married. But as I lay there in the dark, the silence of the house felt less like peace and more like a warning. I knew that the next 7 days would determine the rest of my life. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I wanted him to succeed or if I was just waiting for the final reason to walk away. The next morning, the sun crawled through the blinds of our 1955 house, lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air. I woke up with a stiff neck and a heart that felt like it had been through a meat grinder. My body still ached from the lingering effects of the surgery and the sheer weight of exhaustion that had become my constant companion. I didn't get up right away. I just lay there, listening to the sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing by. It was the sound of a life I had built entirely on my own back, and the weight of it was starting to feel unbearable. I heard him get up. I heard the floorboards creak as he walked to the kitchen. I heard the coffee maker start. Usually I'd be up by now, already an hour into my first shift, juggling a baby and a spreadsheet. But today, I stayed on the couch. I wanted to see what he would do. I wanted to see if the conversation we'd had the night before had actually registered, or if it had just been more words lost to the wind. He walked into the living room, a mug of coffee in his hand. He looked at me, then at the blanket tangled around my legs. "You're still on the couch?" he asked. There was no warmth in his voice, no concern, just a mild observation. "I'm tired," I said, my voice rasping. "Right," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "Well, I'm gonna go check some job boards, see what's out there." He said it like he was doing me a favor, like looking for a way to support his own family was an act of charity. I didn't say anything. I just watched him walk back into the kitchen. I knew what would happen. He'd sit at the computer for 20 minutes, scroll through a few listings, decide nothing was good enough for him, and then spend the rest of the day playing video games or watching TV while I worked. I got up, finally, and started my day. I had to. The bills didn't care about my heartbreak. The mortgage didn't care about my resentment. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and started typing. I worked through the morning, my fingers moving mechanically across the keys. I stopped only to feed the baby, to change a diaper, to move a load of laundry. By noon, I was already feeling the familiar pull of a migraine. I walked into the kitchen to get some water, and there he was, sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone. "How's the job search going?" I asked, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "Nothing yet," he said, not looking up. "Everything's either too far away or doesn't pay enough. I'm not going to work for peanuts, you know?" I felt a flash of white-hot anger. "I'm working for peanuts at one of my 3 jobs," I said. "And those peanuts are paying for your truck. They're paying for your child support. They're paying for the food you're eating right now." He finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Don't start," he said. "I said I'd try. Give me a break." Give him a break. I had given him years of breaks. I had given him my career, my savings, my physical health, and my sanity. And he wanted a break? I walked back to my desk, my heart hammering against my ribs. I realized then that a week wasn't going to be enough. I realized that the man sitting in my kitchen wasn't the man I had married in the Middle East. That man was gone, if he had ever existed at all. The person left in his place was someone who viewed me as a resource to be tapped, not a partner to be loved. As the afternoon wore on, the weight of the realization started to sink in. I looked at the 3 small scars on my stomach, the physical reminders of the choice he had made for me. I thought about the C-section, the way I had been forced back to work before I could even stand up straight. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had poured into a black hole of his debt and his past. I started to wonder what my life would look like if I stopped. If I stopped paying the truck note. If I stopped paying the child support. If I stopped being the one who held everything together. Would it all come crashing down? Probably. But as I sat there, staring at the screen of my laptop, I realized that I was already living in the ruins. I was just the only one trying to pretend the building was still standing. By the second day of my 1-week trial, the silence in the house had shifted. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a storm front moving in. I woke up at 5 a.m., my body screaming. If you've never had a C-section followed by a secondary abdominal surgery within weeks of each other, count yourself lucky. It feels like your entire midsection is held together by frayed dental floss. Every time I breathed too deeply, I felt a sharp, tugging reminder of what had been taken from me. I sat at my desk in the corner of our cramped living room, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off the tears I didn't have time to wipe away. I had 3 deadlines hitting by noon, 1 for my primary contract, and 2 for the side hustles I'd picked up just to cover his truck insurance and the back taxes he'd forgotten to mention. Click, type, wince, repeat. Around 9 a.m., he drifted into the kitchen. I didn't look up, but I could hear him. The heavy thud of the refrigerator door, the rustle of a bag of chips, the absence of the sound of a laptop opening. Did you find any leads? I asked, my voice flat, my eyes never leaving the spreadsheet. I sent out a couple of resumes, he mumbled. But the market is trash right now. Everyone wants 10 years of experience for entry-level pay. It's a joke. I stopped typing. My hands were shaking. I have 15 years of experience, and I'm working 3 entry-level roles simultaneously, just to make sure your son's child support check clears on the 1st of the month. I don't think we have the luxury of waiting for the perfect market. He didn't respond. He just walked out to the porch to smoke. I watched him through the window of our 1955 house, the house he hated. It was a modest place, sure. The linoleum was peeling in the corners, and the plumbing groaned like a haunted ship every time we ran the shower. But it was ours. Or, more accurately, it was mine. I had fought for this house. I had spent hours on the phone with mortgage brokers, explaining why my income looked erratic as a 1099 worker, pleading our case, while he sat in the car and complained about the neighborhood. I remember the day we moved in. I was exhausted, lugging boxes while pregnant, hoping for a moment of shared triumph. Instead, he stood in the middle of the living room, hands on his hips, and sighed. "Is this it?" he'd asked. "I thought we'd at least have a second bathroom. And the yard. How am I supposed to work on the truck in a yard this small? My parents' place was bigger than this." That comment had been a knife to the heart. We had been living with his parents for months. Months where I felt like an intruder in my own marriage. I had worked myself to the bone to give us independence, and his first reaction was to compare my hard-won success to the safety net his parents provided. As I sat at my desk on day 2, those memories started to loop in my head like a horror movie. I started thinking about the Middle East. I thought about the woman I used to be. Back then, I wore tailored suits. I had a team that reported to me. I had a savings account that felt like a fortress. Now I was a woman who didn't even know what procedure had been performed on her own body until she read her medical discharge papers. That's the part that really haunts me. the holes. When he told me he'd scheduled the surgery, he called it a hysterectomy. He told me it was the only way to be sure. I was so tired, so beaten down by the constant demands of work and motherhood that I didn't even have the strength to Google it. I just went where I was told. It wasn't until later, after the pain and the confusion, that I realized it was a laparoscopic tubal cauterization. They didn't remove anything. They just burned the bridges to my future. And why? Because he didn't like condoms. Because he didn't want the hassle of a vasectomy. It was easier to let me go back under anesthesia, to let me bear the scars, to let me deal with the hormonal fallout. By the afternoon of day 2, the resentment was no longer a simmer. It was a rolling boil. I was cleaning the kitchen because, of course, the dishes from his job hunting lunch were still in the sink when he came back inside. "Hey," he said, leaning against the counter. "The truck's making a weird clicking sound. I think I need to take it into the shop." I stopped scrubbing the pan. I didn't move. "How much?" "I don't know, maybe 500, 700? It's a precision machine, babe. You can't just let these things go." I turned around, the soapy water dripping from my hands onto the floor I had just mopped. "I don't have $700. I just paid the mortgage. I just paid the electricity. I just sent the $1,000 for your son. I am at zero." He rolled his eyes. "Well, can't you just take an extra shift or ask for an advance? I need that truck to get to interviews." "What interviews?" I shouted. The sound of my own voice startled me. It was raw, jagged. "You haven't had an interview in months. You use that truck to go to the gym and to buy cigarettes while I sit in that chair until my legs go numb." "Whoa, calm down," he said, putting his hands up as if I were the one being unreasonable. "You're getting all worked up over nothing. I said I was trying. Why do you have to be so bitter?" Bitter. That word. It's the weapon men like him use when they've run out of excuses. If they can make you the bitter wife, then they don't have to be the failing husband. If you're the one with the attitude problem, then they're the victim of your unreasonable expectations. "I am bitter," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I am bitter because I am a bank to you. I am a maid to you. I am a surrogate mother to your child from another woman. I am a vessel for your convenience. I am everything to everyone, and I am nothing to myself." He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He just shook his head, muttered something about me being on one today, and walked into the bedroom, closing the door behind him. I stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of a life I had paid for, and I looked at my hands. They were red, chapped from the water and the work. I realized then that the week I had promised him wasn't for him to change. He wasn't going to change. A man who watches his wife work 2 days after a C-section isn't a man who is capable of the kind of empathy required for change. The week was for me. It was for me to witness with absolute clarity that there was nothing left to save. But then, day 3 happened. And day 3 changed everything. Day 3 arrived with a physical sensation I can only describe as a slow motion unraveling. I woke up, not to the sound of an alarm, but to the sharp, stinging pull of the incision in my belly button. I rolled over, wincing, and caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror above the dresser. The dresser I'd found at a thrift store and refinished myself because we couldn't afford new furniture. I looked at the 3 small, angry red marks on my torso. 2 on my sides, 1 in the center. The holes. I stood there in the dim morning light, tracing the edges of the bandages. My husband had told me it was a hysterectomy. He'd used that word specifically. Maybe he didn't know the difference, or maybe he just wanted me to think it was something more permanent, something that would end any discussion of more children forever. It wasn't until I sat down that morning, clutching a lukewarm cup of coffee, and actually pulled up the digital patient portal on my laptop, that I saw the truth. Laparoscopic tubal cauterization. They hadn't removed anything. They had just burned the tubes. It sounds so clinical when you read it on a screen. But when you're the one who is sobbing in the car, begging for another option, it feels like an assault. It felt like my body was no longer my own. It belonged to the state, to the hospital, and most of all, it belonged to his convenience. He didn't want to wear a condom. He didn't want to deal with the minor discomfort of a vasectomy. So he he insisted that I go under general anesthesia while still recovering from the trauma of a C-section. I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the surgery. It was the realization of the power dynamic in my own home. I was the engine. I was the fuel. I was the one keeping the wheels turning, and he was just the passenger. A passenger who kept criticizing the driver and asking why we weren't in a faster car. I sat down at my desk. It was 7:30 a.m. My first meeting was at 8. I had to review a series of contracts for a client in a different time zone. My eyes felt like they were full of sand. I started typing, my fingers moving by muscle memory, when the mail slot in the front door clattered. Usually, I wait until the end of the day to get the mail. Bills are easier to face when you've already put in 12 hours of work. But something drew me to the door that morning. I walked over, my gait still stiff, and picked up a small stack of envelopes. Most of it was junk, but there was one thick, official-looking envelope addressed to my husband. It was from a law firm back in the state where his ex-wife lived. My heart did a slow, heavy thud in my chest. I shouldn't have opened it, I know that. But when you're the one paying the $1,000 a month for the child support, you feel a certain level of ownership over the legalities involved. I slid my finger under the flap and tore it open. It wasn't a routine update. It was a notice of delinquency. I stared at the numbers, my brain struggling to make sense of them. I had been giving him the money every single month. I had seen the withdrawals from my account. I had handed him the checks, or watched him transfer the money online. But according to this document, the payments hadn't been made in 3 months. There were late fees. There was interest. There was a threat of license suspension. $3,000. Plus fees. Where had the money gone? I felt the room tilt. I had worked through the pain of a C-section for that money. I had sacrificed my sleep, my health, and my dignity for that money. I had sat at this very desk, bleeding into my clothes, to ensure that his son was taken care of and that he stayed out of legal trouble. And he had taken it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I think I had moved past the point where tears were even possible. I just walked into the bedroom. He was still asleep, his arm draped over his face, looking peaceful, looking rested. I stood at the foot of the bed and waited. I didn't say a word. I just stood there until the weight of my presence eventually pulled him out of sleep. He blinked, squinting at me in the darkness. "What time is it?" he groaned, reaching for his phone. I didn't answer. I just held out the letter. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and took the paper from my hand. I watched his face as he read it. I was looking for a flicker of shame. I was looking for a look of, I can explain. But what I saw instead was a flash of irritation. I told him there was a glitch with the portal, he muttered, tossing the letter onto the nightstand. I'll call them later. A glitch? I asked. My voice was so quiet it was almost a whisper. For 3 months, Mark? Where is the money? I gave you that money. I worked for that money. He sighed, the sound of a man who is being deeply inconvenienced by a minor annoyance. Look, the truck needed tires, and I had some other stuff to take care of. I was going to pay it back once I got the job. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal? The dam finally broke. That's a felony, Mark. They can take your license. They can put you in jail. And you took it from your own son? You took it from me? I didn't take it from you, he snapped, swinging his legs out of bed. You gave it to me for the family. I'm part of the family, right? I decided the truck was a priority so I could get to work. Why are you always looking for a reason to attack me? He stood up, towering over me, trying to use his height to end the conversation. In the past, it might have worked. I might have backed down, apologized for my tone, and gone back to my desk to work another 5 hours to find the missing $3,000. But not today. I'm not attacking you, I said, looking him dead in the eye. I'm looking at you. For the first time, I'm actually seeing you. and I don't like what I see. I walked out of the room. I didn't go back to my desk. I went to the kitchen and started packing a bag. Not for me, for him. "What are you doing?" he asked, following me into the kitchen, his voice rising in panic. "The week is over," I said. "It's only been 3 days, but I've seen enough. I've seen the holes in my body, I've seen the holes in our bank account, and I've seen the holes in your character. I can't fill them anymore, Mark. I'm empty." I grabbed his duffel bag from the hall closet and threw it onto the kitchen table. "You want a bigger house?" I asked, my voice steady now. "You want a bigger yard? You want a 4-bedroom, 2-bath mansion? Great, go find one. But you're not going to do it on my dime. And you're definitely not going to do it while you're living in this small, old house that I paid for." He laughed, a short, dry sound that was meant to be mocking but came out sounding desperate. "You're kicking me out? Over a late payment? Where am I supposed to go? I don't have a job." "I don't know," I said. "Maybe your parents have a bigger yard. Maybe they'll pay for your truck tires. But as of right now, I am no longer your employer, your landlord, or your bank." He started to argue, to plead, to turn it back on me. He told me I was being emotional, that I was overreacting because of the hormones from the surgery. He told me I'd regret this, that no one else would want a woman with baggage and kids and scars. But every word he spoke just made the decision easier. It was like watching a movie where the villain finally gives his monologue, revealing just how small and hollow he really is. I didn't stop until his bag was packed. I didn't stop until he was standing on the porch of the 1955 house he hated so much. I didn't stop until I heard the engine of that truck, the truck I was still paying for, start up and pull away. I went back inside and locked the door. Then, I sat down on the floor of my small living room and I breathed. For the first time in years, the air didn't feel heavy. The silence didn't feel like a threat. I looked at my laptop, still sitting on the desk, its screen glowing with the work I still had to do. I had a long road ahead of me. I had debts to pay that weren't mine. I had a body that needed to heal. I had kids who needed a mother who wasn't a ghost. But as I sat there, the sun finally hitting the floorboards, I realized something. I wasn't burnt out anymore. I was on fire. And for the first time, I wasn't burning to keep someone else warm. I was burning for myself. The first night the house was empty, I expected to feel terrified. I expected to sit in the middle of that 1955 living room and feel the crushing weight of being a single mother with 3 jobs and a body held together by surgical thread. I expected to miss him, or at least the idea of him. But as I lay in the bed I had paid for, stretching my legs out into the space where he used to sleep, I didn't feel terror. I felt light. It was the strangest sensation, like a physical burden had been lifted off my chest. For years, I had been carrying the emotional and financial weight of 2 people, and suddenly, I was only carrying my own. It was half the weight I was used to. I woke up the next morning and didn't hear the familiar sound of his heavy footsteps heading to the kitchen to see what I had made for breakfast. I didn't hear the TV blaring some random show while I tried to focus on a client call. I just heard the soft breathing of my children and the hum of the refrigerator. But the peace didn't last long. Around 10 a.m., my phone started vibrating on my desk. It was my mother-in-law. I let it ring 3 times before I picked up. I knew what was coming. Mark had always been their golden boy, the one who just needed a little extra help to get on his feet. They had seen me paying his bills for years, and they had never once told him to step up. They had just been grateful that the burden of their son was someone else's problem. "How could you do this?" she started, not even bothering with the greeting. Her voice was sharp, trembling with a mix of anger and what I suspect was the realization that Mark was now back on her sofa. "He's the father of your children. He's in a bad spot and you just throw him out like trash? In this economy?" I leaned back in my chair and looked at the 3 small scars on my abdomen. "He's a grown man," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. "And he didn't just land in a bad spot. He built a house there and invited me to pay the rent. Did he tell you why I asked him to leave? Did he tell you about the $3,000 of his son's child support that he spent on truck tires and God knows what else? There was a long silence on the other end. Then, the inevitable pivot. He's struggling, Sarah. Men have pride. He probably just felt pressured because you make everything about money. You've always been so focused on your career, you don't realize how that makes a man feel. I almost laughed. I make it about money because money is what keeps the roof over his head. I focus on my career because if I don't, we starve. If my success hurts his pride, he's welcome to go build his own success. But he won't be doing it while I'm bleeding through my stitches to fund it. I hung up. I didn't block her, but I silenced the notifications. I had work to do. But before I could dive back into my spreadsheets, I did something I should have done months ago. I logged into our joint account, the one I had been depositing my extra earnings into for family emergencies. My heart sank as I scrolled through the transactions. I had been so busy working that I hadn't been auditing. It wasn't just the child support. There were dozens of small charges. $100 withdrawals at ATMs near the gym, subscriptions to gaming services I didn't use, meals at restaurants I'd never been to. He had been slowly, methodically bleeding me dry, a few dollars at a time, betting on the fact that I was too exhausted to notice. And he was right. I was too exhausted. But the tubal cauterization, the surgery he forced me into because he didn't want the hassle of a condom, had been the ultimate wake-up call. It was the moment he stopped just taking my money and started taking my bodily autonomy. I called the bank. I froze the account. I opened a new one in only my name. Then, I called the insurance company. I'd like to remove a vehicle from my policy, I told the agent. Which one, ma'am? The truck, I said. The 2022 model. And I'd like to notify the financing company that I will no longer be making payments on that loan. Is it being sold? No, I said, a grim smile spreading across my face. It's being reclaimed by reality. By that afternoon, Mark was calling. I didn't answer. He texted. Then he texted again. You can't do this, Sarah. I need that truck to get to work. What work? I replied. The jobs I'm going to apply for. You're sabotaging me. You're being cruel. I didn't reply to that one. I just went back to work. For the first time in years, I wasn't working to pay off a $15,000 credit card debt or a truck note for a man who mocked my house. I was working for me. I was working to build a cushion so that one day, maybe, I could actually take a day off. As the sun began to set on my first full day of freedom, I walked through the rooms of my small old house. I looked at the 1955 crown molding. I looked at the original hardwood floors that I had spent weekends polishing. I looked at the yard where my kids could play without being shushed because Daddy's taking a nap. This house wasn't a disappointment. It was a miracle. It was a testament to what a woman can achieve when she's being dragged down by an anchor. I realized that if I could accomplish all of this while being emotionally and physically abused, while recovering from surgery, while paying for a grown man's entire life, what could I do now that the anchor was gone? I went to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. I pulled up my shirt and looked at the 3 holes. They were starting to scab over. They were itchy and ugly, and they shouldn't have been there. They were the physical manifestation of his selfishness. But as I looked at them, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. Those scars were a receipt. I had paid the ultimate price for my freedom, and I had the marks to prove it. I was done being the strong wife. I was ready to be the happy woman. I sat down and wrote an update to the people on Reddit who had given me the wake-up call I so desperately needed. I told them he was gone. I told them about the child support and the bank accounts. I told them I was scared, but for the first time in my life, I was also hopeful. I ended the post with a simple sentence. The house might be from 1955, but the life starting inside of it is brand new. But I knew the battle wasn't over. A man like Mark doesn't just walk away when the bank closes. He was going to fight. He was going to use the kids, the vows, and the guilt to try and crawl back into the life I provided. And I had to be ready. I looked at the clock. It was time for my evening shift. I sat down, opened my laptop, and began to type. But this time, I wasn't tired. I was focused. The silence that followed his departure was louder than any argument we'd ever had. It was a vibrating, heavy thing that settled into the corners of my 1955 house, making the air feel thick. For the first few days, I found myself walking on eggshells in my own kitchen, waiting for the inevitable comment about the size of the room or the quality of the coffee. It's funny how trauma lingers in your muscles long after the threat is gone. I'd reach for a pan and flinch, expecting a sigh of disappointment. I'd look at the clock and feel a surge of panic that I hadn't started dinner yet, only to realize there was no one left to complain if I just had a bowl of cereal at my desk. But then, the outside world started to bleed in. Mark didn't go quietly. A man who has spent years being carried doesn't just learn to walk overnight. He tries to find a new person to carry him, and when that fails, he tries to guilt the old one back into service. My phone became a battlefield. At first, it was the remorseful texts. I'm sitting in my parents' backyard, and all I can think about is how much I messed up. I love you, Sarah. I'm lost without you. Please, just let me come home so we can talk like adults. I didn't answer. Then came the practical texts. The bank called about the truck. They said the payment is past due. If you don't pay it, it's going to ruin my credit, and I'll never get a job. Is that what you want? To ruin my life? I stared at that one for a long time. The audacity was almost impressive. He was worried about his credit, the credit I had spent $15,000 of my own savings to repair. He was worried about his life being ruined, while I was literally covered in surgical scars from a procedure he'd coerced me into. I realized then that in Mark's world, he was the only person who truly existed. Everyone else was just a supporting character in the tragedy of Mark, and our only purpose was to provide him with props and funding. I blocked his number. It was the only way to breathe. But you can't block a life. You can't block the reality of 3 jobs and 2 kids and a house that needs constant maintenance. By the end of that first week, I was hitting a wall. The adrenaline of the breakup was fading, and the sheer exhaustion of my life was setting in. I was sitting at my desk at 2 a.m., my eyes burning, trying to finish a project for my second job. My youngest was teething and had finally fallen asleep after hours of crying. I felt like I was vibrating. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely type. I looked at the holes on my stomach. They were healing, but they were itchy and red. Every time I moved, they pulled at my skin, a constant physical reminder of the person who should have been my partner, but chose to be my parasite. I felt a wave of resentment so strong it made me lightheaded. How was I supposed to do this? How was I supposed to be the mother, the provider, the housekeeper, and the healer all at once? That's when I realized the burnout wasn't just about the work. It was about the lack of equity. I wasn't just tired of working. I was tired of working for someone who didn't appreciate it. I was tired of being the only one who cared if we survived. I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I asked for help. Not from Mark, but from my own family. I called my sister, who I hadn't spoken to in months because I was too ashamed of my life to let her see it. I told her everything. The Middle East, the truck, the credit cards, the C-section, and the holes. She was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "Sarah," she said, "we thought you were living the dream. You never told us. Why didn't you tell us?" "Because I wanted it to be true," I whispered. I wanted to believe that if I just worked hard enough, I could make him the man I thought he was. My sister didn't judge me. She didn't tell me I told you so. She just told me she was coming. 2 days later, she was on my doorstep with a suitcase and a bag of groceries. For the first time in years, someone else made the coffee. For the first time in years, someone else held the baby while I took a shower. Having her there was like seeing my life through a different lens. She'd look at the house and say, "This place is so charming, Sarah. You have such an eye for detail." She'd look at my work and say, "I don't know how you do it. You're brilliant." She was reflecting back a version of myself that Mark had spent years trying to erase. He wanted me to feel small so that he could feel big. He wanted me to feel inadequate so that I'd never realize I was the one holding all the power. But as my body started to heal, so did my perspective. I began to see this small old house not as a failure, but as a fortress. It was the place where I had finally drawn the line. It was the place where I had chosen myself over a lie. However, Mark wasn't done. About 10 days after I kicked him out, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked out the window, and my heart dropped into my stomach. It was the truck. He didn't come to the door. He just sat in the driveway, the engine idling, the music thumping. He was waiting for me to come out. He was waiting for me to break. He knew that if he just stayed there long enough, the neighbors would start looking, the kids would start asking questions, and I'd eventually come out to keep the peace. That's what I'd always done. I was the peacekeeper. I was the one who smoothed things over so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. But I looked at my sister who was standing in the kitchen, and I looked at my kids who were playing on the floor, and then I looked at the phone. I didn't go outside. I didn't yell. I didn't beg him to leave. I called the police. "There's a man in my driveway who doesn't live here," I said, my voice steady. "He's been sitting there for 20 minutes and he refuses to leave. I have a restraining order in process." I didn't. Not yet, but I knew I needed to sound like I did. 10 minutes later, a squad car pulled up behind his truck. I watched from behind the blinds as the officers approached his window. I saw Mark's face, the shock, the indignation, the realization that the old Sarah was gone. They talked to him for a few minutes, and then, slowly, he put the truck in reverse and backed out of my life. As the taillights faded into the distance, I felt a strange sense of finality. It wasn't just about the truck. It was about the fact that I had finally stopped being afraid of the discomfort. I had finally stopped caring what the neighbors thought or what his parents thought. I was done being good. I was ready to be free. But the next day, I got a call that I never expected. It was from the hospital where I'd had my procedure. They told me there had been a discrepancy in my billing and insurance paperwork, and they needed me to come in to sign some documents regarding the consent forms for the laparoscopic tubal cauterization. My stomach twisted. Consent forms? I had signed them, hadn't I? Or had I just been so out of it from the C-section recovery that I'd signed whatever Mark put in front of me? I realized then that the holes in my body might hold a secret that would change everything. The drive to the hospital felt like a descent into a past I was trying desperately to bury. Every mile I traveled toward those sterile white walls made the holes in my body throb with a phantom pain. My sister stayed behind with the kids, her hand on my shoulder as I left, a silent promise that she'd be there when I got back. But as I pulled into the parking lot, I felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. I walked through the sliding glass doors, the scent of industrial-grade disinfectant hitting me like a physical blow. It was the same smell as the day of my C-section, the same smell as the day Mark had looked at me with those cold, detached eyes and told me the surgery was for the best. I checked in at the front desk, my voice trembling as I gave my name. A few minutes later, a woman in a sharp suit, not a nurse but an administrator, led me into a small private office. She looked concerned, the kind of professional concern that usually means a lawyer has been consulted. "Mrs. Miller," she began, sliding a folder across the desk, "we were conducting a routine audit of our surgical consent files, specifically focusing on procedures performed within a certain window of major obstetric surgery. When we reviewed your file for the laparoscopic tubal cauterization, we noticed some irregularities." My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. Irregularities? What kind of irregularities? She opened the folder. There, at the bottom of a 4-page document, was my signature. Except, as I leaned in, I realized it wasn't mine. It was a shaky, slanted imitation of my handwriting. It looked like someone had tried to sign a moving piece of paper. "This document," she pointed to the section titled Patient Acknowledgement of Risks and Alternatives, "is dated 36 hours after your emergency C-section. You were on a high dosage of post-operative pain medication at the time. According to the nursing logs, you were semi-conscious when this was purportedly signed. I stared at the ink. I remembered Mark standing over my bed. I remembered him holding a pen. I remembered him saying, "Just sign this, babe. It's just the discharge paperwork for the baby. I've already handled everything." I had trusted him. I had been in a fog of pain and exhaustion, my body literally cut open and stitched back together. And he had used that moment of ultimate vulnerability to forge my consent for a procedure I had explicitly told him I didn't want. "There's more," the administrator said, her voice dropping an octave. "We have a recorded statement from your husband, well, your husband at the time, given to the surgical coordinator. He claimed that you had a pre-existing psychological condition that made you incapable of making rational, long-term reproductive decisions during high-stress periods, and that he held a medical power of attorney. He provided a document that we now believe was, let's say, legally insufficient." I felt the room tilt. He hadn't just pressured me. He hadn't just coerced me. He had lied to the medical staff. He had painted me as mentally unstable to bypass my right to say no to my own surgery. He had orchestrated a medical violation of my body while I was too weak to fight back. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Because the surgeon who performed the procedure is no longer with the hospital, and the oversight was significant," she said carefully. "The hospital wants to ensure you are aware of the situation and, well, we are prepared to offer a settlement to avoid litigation, provided you sign a non-disclosure agreement." I looked at the folder. I looked at the forged signature. I looked at the 3 small scars on my stomach through the fabric of my shirt. They wanted me to sign another paper. They wanted to buy my silence for the holes Mark had put in my life. "I won't sign anything today," I said, standing up. My legs felt like lead, but my mind was suddenly piercingly clear. I walked out of that office, past the front desk, and into the bright, harsh sunlight of the parking lot. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just got into my car and sat there, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The burnout was gone. In its place was something much more dangerous, a cold, calculated fury. I realized then that Mark hadn't just been a lazy husband. He hadn't just been a leech. He was a predator. He had seen my strength, my success, and my independence as things to be harvested. And when he couldn't control me through money, he decided to control me through my flesh. I didn't go home right away. I drove to a small law office on the edge of town. I didn't have an appointment, but I didn't care. I walked in and told the receptionist I needed to speak to someone about medical battery and fraud. As I sat in the waiting room, I thought about the thousands of dollars I'd spent on his child support. I thought about the $15,000 credit card debt. I thought about the truck. I thought about how he'd mocked my 1955 house while he was actively plotting to take away my future children. I realized that the 1 week I had given him was a joke. He didn't deserve a week. He didn't even deserve a second of my thoughts. What he deserved was the full weight of the law crashing down on him. By the time I got home, my sister was waiting on the porch. She saw my face and stood up. "Sarah? What happened?" "He forged it," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from someone else. "He forged my signature while I was in the hospital. He lied to the doctors. He told them I was crazy." My sister's face went pale. "Oh my God, Sarah." "I'm not going to be the strong wife anymore," I said, walking past her into the house. "And I'm not going to be the bitter ex. I'm going to be the plaintiff." I spent the rest of the night on the phone. I called the bank again, this time with a police report number for the stolen child support funds. I called the truck's financing company and told them exactly where the vehicle was located, at his parents' house, and that I was officially withdrawing any claim to the vehicle, effectively inviting them to repossess it. Then I did the hardest thing of all. I called Mark's ex-wife. We hadn't spoken in years. Mark had always painted her as the crazy ex who was just out for his money. But as the phone rang, I wondered how much of that was true. I wondered if she had her own scars. "Hello?" a weary voice answered. It's Sarah, I said. Mark's, well, I guess his soon-to-be ex-wife. I'm calling because I think you and I have some things to talk about. Starting with the $3,000 of child support that he never sent you. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, I wasn't just angry. I was horrified. She told me about the glitches in the portal that had been happening for years. She told me about the lies he told her to keep us from talking to each other. She told me that he had used my success, my career, my money, as a weapon against her, telling her she'd never get a dime because I controlled all the finances. He had played us against each other. He had used me as a shield and her as his scapegoat. I'm sorry, I told her, my voice breaking. I am so sorry. I didn't know. I know you didn't, she said. He's a master at making you feel like you're the only one who can save him. But Sarah, you're not his savior. You're his latest victim. And I'm glad you're out. I hung up the phone and looked out the window at my small yard. The moon was high, casting long shadows across the grass. I felt a strange sense of peace. The web was unraveling. The lies were falling apart. But I knew Mark wouldn't go down without a fight. He was a cornered animal now, and cornered animals bite. I just didn't realize how hard he was willing to bite until the next morning, when a process server knocked on my 1955 front door. I opened the door, expecting more paperwork from the bank. Instead, I was handed a summons. Mark was suing me. He was suing me for spousal support, full custody of the children, and exclusive use of the 1955 house, claiming that my unstable mental state and medical history made me an unfit mother. He was using the very surgery he had forced me into as evidence that I wasn't capable of caring for our kids. I looked at the paper, and then I looked at the process server. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I just smiled, because Mark had made one fatal mistake. He thought I was still the woman who begged him on the operating table. He didn't realize that woman had died the moment he closed the door. The woman standing here now? She had 3 jobs, a sister who had her back, a lawyer on speed dial, and 3 small scars that reminded her every single day why she was never, ever going to stop fighting. The summons felt heavy in my hand, like a cold piece of lead. I stood in the doorway of my 1955 house, the morning sun mocking me with its brightness. I read the words again. Unstable mental state. Medical history. Unfit mother. He was actually doing it. He was trying to take the only things I had left. The children I had nearly died to bring into this world, and the home I had nearly killed myself to pay for. It was a classic move. The kind of psychological warfare used by people who know they have no moral ground to stand on. If you can't win on the facts, you attack the person. If you can't justify your own laziness, you pathologize the other person's exhaustion. My sister came up behind me, taking the paper from my hand. I watched her eyes scan the legalese, her face turning a deep, dangerous shade of red. "He's trying to use the surgery against you," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "The surgery he forced you to get. The one he forged your name for." "He thinks he's being smart," I said, and to my surprise, a laugh bubbled up in my chest. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had finally seen the bottom of the abyss and realized there was nowhere left to fall. "He thinks because I was tired and broken, I'll just roll over. He thinks the hospital record will show I'm unstable because I was crying and medicated." I walked over to my desk, that same desk where I'd spent thousands of hours earning the money that fueled his life, and I picked up the phone. I didn't call Mark. I didn't call his parents. I called the lawyer I had spoken to the day before. "He just served me," I told her. "He's going for custody and the house. He's claiming I'm mentally unfit because of the mental health crisis surrounding my tubal cauterization." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning. "He just handed us the rope to hang him with," she said firmly. "Sarah, listen to me. By putting your mental state at the center of his claim, he has opened the door for us to subpoena every single medical record, every nursing note, and every communication from that hospital stay, including the forged consent form. He just made his fraud the central evidence of the case. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. If I thought I was working hard before, it was nothing compared to the war I was now waging. I was still working my 3 jobs because the mortgage didn't stop for lawsuits, but every spare second was spent scanning documents, digging through old bank statements, and recording every single interaction I'd ever had with Mark that proved his pattern of financial abuse. I found the emails where I begged him to look for work. I found the texts where he told me I was crazy for wanting him to contribute. I found the receipts for his truck tires that matched the exact dates the child support payments went missing. But the most powerful piece of evidence didn't come from a computer. It came from the hospital. My lawyer filed a motion for an emergency hearing. Because he was seeking to remove the children from the home based on an alleged mental health crisis, the judge granted a preliminary appearance within 10 days. The morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the mirror in my bathroom. I wore a sharp navy blue suit, the kind of suit the Middle East Sarah used to wear. I looked at the 3 small scars on my abdomen. They were healed now, faint pink marks that looked almost like stars. They didn't feel like holes anymore. They felt like battle scars. When I walked into that courtroom, Mark was already there. He was sitting at the petitioner's table, wearing a suit I had bought for him 2 years ago for a job interview he never went to. He looked groomed, polished, and perfectly concerned. His parents were in the gallery, looking at me with a mixture of pity and disdain. He didn't look at me, not at first. He kept his eyes on his lawyer, playing the part of the grieving, worried father. When the judge called the case, Mark's lawyer stood up and began a monologue that made me sound like a monster. He talked about my erratic behavior, my obsession with work, and how I had suffered a nervous breakdown following the birth of our child, leading to a desperate medical procedure that I now regretted and was blaming on my husband. I felt my sister's hand grip mine under the table. I stayed silent. I had learned the hard way that when someone is digging a hole, you don't interrupt them. You let them finish. Then, it was our turn. My lawyer didn't start with my work ethic. She didn't start with the house. She started with a single document. She walked up to the judge and handed over a blow-up of the consent form from the hospital. "Your Honor," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "The petitioner claims my client is mentally unfit due to the circumstances of her surgery. We agree that the circumstances were traumatic, but the trauma didn't come from a breakdown. It came from a crime." She then presented the nursing logs. She read the notes aloud, the ones that described me as lethargic, minimally responsive, and recovering from anesthesia. Then she read the note from 30 minutes later, where Mark had entered the room with the paperwork. "The hospital has already admitted, in writing, that this signature is a forgery," my lawyer continued. "We have a sworn affidavit from a handwriting expert, and we have the hospital's internal memo stating that the petitioner misrepresented himself as having medical power of attorney to bypass his wife's explicit refusal of this procedure." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. I looked over at Mark. The concerned father mask was slipping. His face had gone a sickly shade of gray. He started whispering frantically to his lawyer, who looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. "But it doesn't stop at medical battery," my lawyer said, pivoting to the financial records. She laid out the trail of the stolen child support. She showed the judge the bank records, proving that I had been the sole provider for every single cent of our lives, while the petitioner was systematically embezzling family funds for his own luxury. The judge, a stern woman with eyes that seemed to see through everything, looked at Mark. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice like ice, "do you have any documentation to support the claim that you held medical power of attorney at the time of this surgery?" Mark stood up, his voice cracking. I thought I did. We talked about it. She was so upset. I was just trying to help." "Did you sign her name?" the judge interrupted. Mark hesitated. The silence stretched until it felt like it would break the room. "I signed it for her." because she couldn't. She couldn't because she was medicated, the judge snapped. And she couldn't because she had already told you no. You didn't sign for her. You signed against her. The hearing didn't last much longer. The judge denied his request for custody. She denied his request for the house. In fact, she issued an immediate temporary restraining order, barring him from the property and from contacting me for any reason other than through legal counsel. But the real kicker came at the very end. Furthermore, the judge said, based on the evidence of financial fraud and the admission of forged medical documents, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into medical battery and identity theft. I watched as the color completely drained from Mark's parents' faces. They had spent their lives protecting their golden boy, and now he was facing actual criminal consequences. Mark looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time. There was no love in his eyes, only a pure, concentrated venom. But I didn't care. For the first time in years, I wasn't responsible for his feelings. I wasn't responsible for his future. I was only responsible for mine. As I walked out of that courthouse, the air felt different. It was crisp and clean. My sister hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would crack. You did it, she sobbed. Sarah, you really did it. I went home to my 1955 house. I walked inside, and for the first time, I didn't see the peeling linoleum or the small kitchen. I saw a sanctuary. But the story doesn't end with a courtroom victory. It ends with a realization. A few weeks later, the truck was repossessed from Mark's parents' driveway. I heard he tried to fight the tow truck driver, crying about how it was his only way to get his life back. He never got the life back, because that life was a fiction built on my labor. I'm still working 3 jobs, but I'm down to 2 now, because without his debts and his needs, my income actually goes a long way. I've started a savings account for my kids that he can't touch. I've started a house fund to finally fix that plumbing he hated so much. And the holes? They're still there. I'll never be able to have more children. That's a grief I carry every day. But I've realized that while he could take my fertility, he couldn't take my power. I shared my final update on Reddit, and the outpouring of support was overwhelming. Thousands of women reached out to tell me their own stories of holes and anchors, and the moment they finally decided to swim. If you're listening to this and you feel like you're drowning in someone else's life, I want you to know something. You are not a bank. You are not a maid. You are not a vessel for someone else's convenience. You are the architect of your own existence. It might take a small old house to realize it. It might take some scars to prove it. But you are worth the fight. What would you do if you found out your partner had been forging your life away while you were at your most vulnerable? Would you have the strength to walk away after everything you'd sacrificed? Let me know in the comments. Your stories matter, and your strength is more powerful than you know. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and share it with someone who might need a wake-up call today. As for me, I'm going to sit on my porch in my 1955 house and watch the sunset. And for the first time in a very long time, I'm not going to do a single thing for anyone else.